Ladies and gentle beings, welcome to Memes Testing, where I play games wrong and see if they're still completable. Today, we teeter on the edge of reason in Lies of P, as we try and beat this game without using any weapons. The easy part will be defining how we win this time, as the game has a clear endpoint, and it labels everything that goes in these two slots here as weapons, and anything that goes here as a Legion arm. Outside of this category here, I'm calling everything fair game. That includes the throwables, consumables, and the Legion arm itself. On top of this, a lovely feature of not having a weapon equipped in this game means that you cannot even attack with your unarmed fist. This means that every single point of damage we're going to be doing this run comes from throwable objects or the Legion tools at our disposal. This means we don't have to worry about giving anyone any love taps and having to restart the run, as we physically cannot. To begin, we wake up on a train and move on down to choose our weapon. None of these will matter, of course, but we do have an option between 3 different stat distributions. As a side note, I would really like to know what each of these stats do before I select the class. It's not really a huge deal, but it did lead me to putting points into Vigor, as I'd read online that this has increased the Legion. What they actually meant in that article was capacity, as this both increases your carry weight and your Legion capacity. This was annoying, but it is expected nowadays, as most of the day one nonsense articles are rushed out and corrected whenever they can get round to it. Anyway, we unequip our weapon and move on out of the train. And just to start, this game is absolutely beautiful. It is truly one of the better looking Souls-like games that I have played in quite a while. If they were going for the Bloodborne based aesthetic, I really think they nailed it here, and honestly, this is probably the closest thing to Bloodborne I have played on a PC. So if you are wanting to try Bloodborne, but don't have a PlayStation 4 or 5 to play it on, I would highly recommend pausing this now, if you have any interest at all in this game, and go play it. It's free on the Xbox Game Pass, it's available on Steam, it is widely available, and I would highly recommend it. So, as of now, we find our only option for combat is our left hand, and with the starting class we chose, we can use it a spicy 5 times. However, a single punch with this will not take out an enemy. This is the point now where I learned that you can charge this attack, and this is what makes the run even remotely possible. As we are not able to level up in the tutorial area, the main issue comes with being able to kill the first mini-boss. This is why we chose the strength class to start with. Even with the 5 charge attacks for maximum damage, this mini-boss will still live. The only saving grace to this entire run is the fact that there are a handful of throwable objects which are not farmable currently, that we can use to take out the last 50 HP or so on the mini-boss and get the key out to the world proper. From this point, we can now level up, and surely at this point we have infinite possibilities, and the run becomes massively less complicated, right? No. Due to how this game was made, before the first boss is defeated and we make it to the Blue Fairy, there is a level cap of 20. We start at 10. So we have 10 level ups to our name in order to become strong enough to beat the first boss. The best way to distribute our stats is going to be getting to 216 Legion, as this will allow us an extra attack, totaling 6, and then putting all of the remaining points in either strength or dexterity, as the Legion Fist scales equally with both. This, however, is not enough to beat the first boss alone. In fact, at max level 20, 6 fully charged attacks would deal just about half of its health. This is where one of my main issue comes in, as I am currently on my 3rd character, and after reading the misinformation I mentioned above, I realized that even with the consumables that I can buy to throw at the boss and the 2 thermite that I found in the tutorial and this area, it still won't be enough to kill the boss. So I had to start a currently 4th character because I had put points into Vigor, which essentially were wasted and had no benefit for us, in order to even remotely attempt to min-max this to make it possible. However, this did let me do some testing with the useless character, and with the 5 throwables that I had saved, and 6 attacks on the boss, we were able to deal about 90% of its health, all told, after the burn and shock status effects had worn off. This means we had to find about 400 damage somewhere. This is where the sawtooth gears come in that we use to kill the tutorial mini-boss, as they have about a 5% chance to drop on the normal enemies in this area. We're going to need about 12 to 15 of these, depending on if we hit the enemy while they're attacking or not. So I'm going to farm about 20 just to be safe, just in case I miss. As the thermite and shock throwables are not dropped, this is our only chance. These do not respawn. They are not purchasable again from the merchant. He only has 3. This means that even after 2 hours of farming all of this nonsense, if I miss a thermite or a shock throwable, I have to restart the entire character. Thankfully, outside of the hitbox for the sweep attack being a little janky, I had little to no issue dealing with this boss. Possibly because I spent about 10 minutes learning his attacks beforehand on the burnt character that had points in Vigor. I will eventually stop bringing this up, but I am still salty. I wasted 90 minutes for no reason. So, first things first, we move in with the 6 attacks that we can do, as if we miss any of these, we have to restart anyway. But at least this gauge refills at the Stargazer. So, once we hit these and I feel comfortable with my health situation, we start in with the thermite and shock throwables. And again, we're down by about 90%. And it is just panic throwing all of these gears until the boss goes down. This definitely was the weirdest start to one of these challenge runs, as there was a hard barrier not only in area, as the game is very linear, but also in level and the consumables that we had to work with. Honestly, I really enjoyed working this out. And fun fact, this first character that I made was going to be for a truth only run, but the door to Hotel Krat requires you to lie in order to get in. We make it inside the hotel and meet the Blue Fairy, and yes, we can now level up past 20, which is excellent because I have about 10 levels worth of experience on me, which was saved up on the grind for those gears, and knowing that I couldn't level up beyond this point only makes that Parade Master boss just that touch more frustrating. Anyway, we introduce ourselves to each of the people in this area as we meet the lovely lady, which only upgrades our weapons, so pretty much the only time we'll see her throughout this run, and the proprietress of the lovely hotel, who seems to be slowly petrifying in front of my eyes, so we're going to move on from here as well. We move on out with 6 attacks to our name, and mainly just run through the Elysium Boulevard, stopping only to pick up the Stargazers and killing any of the mini-bosses that we find where possible, and eventually we make our way up to the bridge, where we find our next mini-boss, actual boss. It has a boss health bar, but acts more like a mini-boss. This is the first human-based enemy that we find, and they are known as the Mad Donkey. And yes, we get wrecked, as I have some flashbacks to watching Pinocchio as a child, and that donkey scene has stuck with me far more than I'd like to admit at this point. So it looks like even with our attacks, we won't even be able to fully take down this donkey. But there is a new item that we can throw on our belts, and that is the Legion magazine. This lovely little fellow allows us to regenerate some Legion, so we can actually attack more than 6 times. As you can see with the footage, however, it regenerates about a punch and a half, which is a lot less than I was hoping for, but I'll take what I can get. Between these Legion magazines and the remaining throwables we have to our name, we are able to take down this rampant ass and free Geppetto from a nearby carriage. Like the absent father he is, he greets us with his lukewarm presence and proceeds to thank us for freeing him from the perturbed mule. This is where we move on down the street to Krat City Hall and meet the second boss proper. This is where we realize that the boss has about 3 times the health that we can dish out with our 6 punches. Even with the maximum 3 Legion magazines that we can bring with us, this totals about 11 punches if I'm being absolutely generous. So now we've reached the part of our story that gets a little bit sad, as we're going to have to grind outside the boss room on these 3 fellows and their dog. So after about 3 hours we accumulate enough ergo to allow our fist to deal significant damage. This is where the leftover sawtooth gears from the first boss come in, as we are just able to squeak out a victory here with our remaining throwables in hand. From this boss, we are able to get a new Legion arm that the lovely lady back at the hotel is able to make for us, which allows us to deal shock damage, which deals extra damage to automata. This is what I wish I had about 2 hours ago, as it deals about 50% more damage, but that may not be the case as the boss also did shock damage, so I guess we'll call it a wash. Now we move on to the Venini Works, where we meet a lot of horrifying mannequins. I've skipped over a bunch of things to this point, but a lot of the mechanical beings we've been fighting are clockwork in nature, and honestly are incredibly stylized. Just a bounty to the eyes. But these dollar store mannequins are just the opposite. They're smooth and reside a little too much into that uncanny valley for me. While the others are much more robotic, they are in such a way that you can definitely tell that they're mechanical. These mannequins, not so much. And it just makes me that little bit uncomfortable. Anyway, we'll unpack that mental scarring later as we move on to the robot of the future. A massive fellow that is standing in a pool of corrosive garbage. First attempt at this one actually went pretty well thanks to our new shocking grasp, but as I have the attention span of a mayfly, I fail to remember that I'm slowly being poisoned to death, and the first attempt goes the way of the ancients. However, running around in circles in the workshop eventually led me to this lever right here, which, after some trial and error, I realized drained the poisonous swamp that had previously taken me. With the poison no longer in play, it made for a much easier attempt at the robot of the future, taking it down on our second attempt without too much effort. However, this is the point where I realised that this boss is optional, and the boss was clearly just stuck in this pit on its own. Proceeding down, we eventually found the actual boss of this area, a living toaster that introduced a new status effect to us, Overheat. This works pretty much like any other burn in these types of games. When it's inflicted on you, you take damage over time. And the boss itself is pretty much just a pushover, as on our first attempt we get over halfway done with it without using too much of our resources. And then I go down to that lack of attention span I mentioned previously as I slowly burn to death. But with a little more Legion in the tank, I fairly easily mowed down the furnace, and we learn that there is a new face in the hotel, the great Venini. He decided to take up residence in what I assume is the only refuge for humans at this point. He actually is the one that we can thank this challenge run for, as it appears that he has made the Legion arms themselves. Along with this, we get the ability to upgrade Legion arms and a new option for our arsenal. Now we can either punch, shock, or burn, and very soon you'll figure out which preference I have of the three, as it is pervasive moving forward. Now we can move on to the Moonlight Town and start making our way towards the chapel. This is where we get introduced to the third of the three types of enemies that we have fought so far. We've had Clockwork, and we've had a human, but now we have these afflicted zombie-like beings known as carcasses. These are incredibly weak to fire, which we found out relatively quickly after we moved here, and after struggling fairly hard before realizing, I literally walked through the area burning every single thing down. It turns out being able to stay a good 2 to 3 feet away from melee enemies while burning them to cinders is just so effective. After struggling so hard previously, I could not believe how fun this game was, as taking these guys down in a tick or two of the flame-spewing sidearm, we were very easily able to move up to the dilapidated cathedral, and we get a small glimpse of what is to come. I really like that they foreshadow the boss like this. So far the game has been very visually pleasing, but realistically I haven't seen much that I wasn't expecting, as most of the story beats so far have been fairly lackluster, and all of the bosses have just been a curb stomp once we have the ability to deal more than their maximum health worth of damage. But this is where things change for me, as I have said nothing outside of the visual elements that got my attention up until now, but meeting the Archbishop definitely skewed my expectations for what we were doing. Just as the Clockwork had become stale and the humans were basically non-existent as enemies, this monstrosity that has shown up before me honestly does not mess around. At first, I thought it was the most disappointing boss in the game by far, as I was able to go in hard and put on a large amount of pressure. Avoiding the large sweeping attacks was fairly easy, and as it had that massive weakness to fire. But then something happened that I apparently completely forgot was a feature of these type of games. As Phase 2 happened. Now, for some ungodly reason, I seem to have forgotten or willfully ignored the fact that bosses can have multiple phases, but I do blame it on my reliance on these more recent Souls games, as they will more often than not transition the boss mid-health bar, not after the bar is depleted, and this wonderfully caught me off guard, as this giant lumbering beast has now turned into a righteous one-winged angel. There is something about this fight that I genuinely enjoyed, despite how hard it became after this phase. Our main problem is the limited resources, and my lack of ability to dodge consistently. But after farming a little bit more capacity and picking up a few more of those consumables, we were able to take down the boss without too much difficulty, and with that lasting impression, Heightening our expectations, we move forward. This is the part of the game where I really began enjoying myself, as so far I had just been seeing if this was possible, without thinking too much on whether I was enjoying the experience or taking it in. But after a half dozen attempts at that gargantuan green monstrosity, I fell into a love for this game that was both unexpected and fairly well deserved. Moving further down, we get more of those carcass enemies, as they seem to be moving into a more populated area where they have either come from or taken over. While we walk through these battered streets, we meet a duo, which I failed to mention earlier, as they were in the Venini Works, looking down on us as we were fighting the Puppet of the Future, but this is Red Fox and Black Cat. Previously, they seemed somewhat friendly, and had actually sold me a in-universe guide, and because of this I decided to help them as our goals seemed to align as we were looking to take down the Black Rabbit Brotherhood. As we made it through the slums, they ham-fistedly exposited and made it quite obvious that they were no real friends of mine and were only using me for their own means. As we moved on towards the next boss, they took up residence outside of the boss gate and would taunt me every time I went in. Until about the sixth time, at which point they seemed to have just left to do their own thing while I struggled against this boss. Speaking of the fight, I lost a reckless amount of time to the eldest of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, but don't let the boss title fool you. The eldest is the only one that needs to die, but you're fighting all four of them. At 75, 50, and 25% health, the next sibling will join the fray, and things become unruly very quickly. I tried this probably a dozen times before deciding that I simply just need to farm, and luckily, a previous area in the Malum district where this takes place has the Red Lobster Inn. In here, there is a carcass enemy worth a solid 500 ergo. At this point in the game, that is the single best amount I can get from one enemy, and it goes down fairly quick to a light smattering of fire. However, after about an hour of doing this, I realized that I'm an idiot. And just off to the right when I move in, there is a semi-hidden ladder. This obscures a passage upwards to a secret merchant, where if you had found a seal of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood earlier in the game, you're able to purchase some black market goods. And if this guy isn't the single most important person in this entire run, he has an unlimited supply of every throwable that I care about in this game. We're talking pipes, saw blades, thermite, shock throwables, decay throwables, every single thing I could care about at almost extortionate pricing. We're looking at an average of about 500 per item, of which I take about 4 with me at this point in the game of each type. So each attempt at a boss is going to be costing me about 12,000 souls if everything is used. Obviously, these will be used as sparingly as possible, but due to the fact that we have a limited maximum damage output only using the Legion arm, these not only will be necessary, but the single most important part of this run, as without them, it is nigh impossible without leveling beyond a ridiculous level. But with them, I came to realize that a lot of this game is entirely melee focused, and for good reason. There are no ranged weapons outside of arguably 2 of the Legion arms, Puppet String and Falcon Eyes, but not many people would be doing this with only throwing weapons, or likely be spec'd so heavily into the stats that they use for them to be as useful as we have. Because all of the elemental uses that we have here scale with the same stats that make our flamethrower just ever so useful. And as you can see from the footage in the background, this became quite the slaughter. Being able to pick off people at a range and hold them back with status effects ticking on each of them while we safely moved out of the way of all of the swiping, vaulting, stabbing, shimming, and sweeping attacks, we readily were able to take this boss down in one attempt after we were actually equipped. This run has just become much more interesting and far more enjoyable, as it turns out not having to ration your supplies while having to balance that with farming is, to me at least, a much more enjoyable experience, as I don't mind farming for 20 to 30 minutes for a couple good boss attempts if I know it's reasonably possible for it to happen. So at this point I decided to stock up on literally everything after the boss was done, as I put their ergo to good use, as well as farming for no less than about 4 hours to get what I would assume would be an entire game's worth of throwable supplies. Moving on, we're told that the King of Puppets is behind all of this, and I'm fairly confused as I'm probably around the 12-hour mark at this point in the game, and I know it's going a lot slower than most people would, considering how much I'm having to farm. So, moving on to the Opera District, I'm fairly sure this is a bait and switch, but I was immediately taken back by the fact that not only is this area incredibly visually pleasing, but this is where the soundtrack itself hit me with such a well put together theme. In the Opera District, there is a mini-boss arena that plays a musical track in an amphitheater. This music is coming from a mannequin that once you interact with it, the boss fight will start. But during this time, I was enjoying the music that was emanating from it on the lead up so much that when I actually got to this amphitheater, I ended up sitting there for around 10 minutes just listening to the song, trying to figure out if it was French or not. I speak a little French, not fantastically, but I did pick up some words that I thought felt French, and after some time of listening to this in the background, tabbed out trying to figure out what was going on, I realized that this was a Portuguese song, and it just fit the area and the themes so far just spectacularly. This is when I realized that there was a mini-boss staring at me, ever so politely, just waiting for me to touch this mannequin. I don't have words for this. I truly am falling for this game. It is without a doubt the best thing I've played this year. Continuing on to the Opera House itself, I ended up listening to the track outside of the game as I had just enjoyed it that much. Going from strength to strength, we make our way through the Opera House and come to a third type of puppet. These I can only describe as marionettes, as they are the first puppets we see in this entire game with strings. It's a little unnerving, and I couldn't quite explain why, until I realized that from the entrance, I had perceived something without realizing it, as these puppets with strings are being controlled by other puppets. There are large spider-like beings in this area that are on the top level that have flowing strings coming from them that spawn these marionettes. And there was something just uncomfortable about a puppet being controlled by another puppet. This is just a beautiful inclusion in hindsight, as we eventually moved on to my second favourite boss in this whole game, the King of Puppets. The fight itself is great, as it starts with a vignette of reasonable importance in hindsight. What I thought was a fun nod to a possible future betrayal actually turned out to be something more. And without getting into spoilers, this entire fight in hindsight is much more heartbreaking. The king himself, however, is, at least to start with, a fairly paint-by-numbers boss, as we have a large enemy with some sweeping attacks. We throw in some light area denial in the form of these ergo bombs, and apart from that, a fairly lackluster phase 1. But phase 2 happens, and I was blown off of my feet, as this fight moves from a slow, lumbering creature to one of my favourite forms of Souls-like combat, which is when you find a human-sized enemy. This kicked the boss up a few notches alone for me, as at this point it was definitely my favourite, even above the Archbishop, which I gushed at previously. As it turns out, this large mech was piloted by a puppet. A lovely inclusion of theme for this area, as this is the first time we see a puppet controlling a puppet, and the fact that they included this as possible foreshadowing is just absolutely beautiful. The fight itself at this point is much more hectic, magnitudes faster, the inclusion of additional status effects. The scything weapon it uses can be lit on fire, and the ground itself, when it sprints around to try and flank you, is also a danger, as if you touch it, you will burn. This, with the aerial attacks it includes, and the fact that you can interrupt him from some of his attacks with sheer damage, gives us a few good options to try and combat this, even if we are not able to block or properly stagger an enemy as we have the weapon. After all was said and done, I cannot say I did not cackle in enjoyment, as this fight harkened back to some of the very first times I'd played the Soul series and come across a boss that was just overwhelming in its presence. While I didn't fail too many times to this boss, it was not due to lack of resources like the previous ones. This genuinely put me through my paces with my limited defensive options. Anyway, enough gushing about Romeo. We move on past his arena, and we're met with dear old Dad. He congratulates us on stopping the puppet frenzy that the Puppet King had created. And at this point, I'm sure no other puppets will be of issue for the remainder of this game. Now we have to move on to the Grand Exhibition, and we see an old friend, as it looks like the Puppet of the Future was first designed and put to use here as a display piece. For the exhibition itself, it is a lovely idea that, of course, this steampunk city has a dedicated area where all the inventors can strut their stuff, having a local fair, as it were, for all their marvels. Nothing really of note in this area outside of the sheer spectacle of all the inventions, as we move on to the champion victor. And sad to say that if the previous boss was a highlight, this is realistically one of the lowlights of the game, as I am almost certain that this boss would have been harder if we were in melee range, but At that point, we would have had the ability to block and parry his attacks, as this boss is essentially just a meat wall. As you enter the arena, he will rush you, and he only has some punching attacks, as well as, I believe, a single kick, but I don't remember too much of the fight at this point. All accompanied with a shock element, which I don't believe was an issue. Even after he moved to phase 2 and went full Bane, with his attacks speeding up, the arcs becoming larger, and the movements becoming more erratic, it was just a disappointment. We were able to face tank everything. Now, the fact that we don't have a weapon means that we can have some fairly good movement, as the roll system is, like most others, based on your carry capacity. But the fact that we don't have a weapon allows us to free up much more weight for heavier armor. So at this point in the game, we're rocking about 30% physical damage reduction, and it shows. Just when I thought there was going to be a highlight of the boss fight itself, seeing what was almost certainly a phase 3, the boss was unceremoniously executed by a spiky figure as a clear leader showed up, as this intimidating foe is Simon Manus, the head of the Alchemist Society and a former work associate of Geppetto. After a standard villain rant and asking what we think of these revived abominations, we are told that they are heading off to Alchemist Island, and if we want to follow them, Venini says we'll need to find a golden ergo, so that he can create some type of device that will allow us to travel there. For this, we continue on to the Barren swamps, and realistically, there's nothing to deal with here. There's a large tower which shoots ballista bolts, or cannon fire. They do explode, but just walking or running at a decent pace while avoiding the swamp itself deals with that without any issue. For the boss itself that we eventually come to, it is a interesting beast, as to start with, it has a new status effect, the decay that I mentioned earlier, but it only applies that with its thinner tendril-like appendages. Most everything else is just the standard fare of sweeping and lunging attacks, with a charge attack thrown in, which covers most of the arena. Until phase 2 starts, and we begin to have a fun time. As I use polymerization on King of the Swamp and this pile of garbage, I create a slightly harder boss. But for real, nothing crazy in this swamp. Mainly, it just becomes slightly less weak to fire, and that's it. The only new attacks would be the spinning arm one from the second boss, which I believe is what it is, just cannibalized. And with minimal effort, we do end up with the golden ergo as mentioned, and our local bon vivant makes us a car battery with it. Honestly, I was expecting some type of teleporter, but sure, I'll lug around a car battery for you. While we were moving through the swamp, however, we did note that there was a earthquake in the area, as we are nearby the Krat Central Station. As we move on back towards the hotel, we actually make it through towards the station, and it is our old stomping grounds, as we have moved back to the beginning, and it has been slimed. I had a wonderful time getting through this area, as pretty much everything can be burned to a crisp, as it is my preferred modus operandi. But as we move out to the former lovely city, we realize that it's been taken over by these crystals that are putting out a rather unfortunate status effect that if the bar fills, we die. Distortion is essentially death like an Elden Ring or Curse from the Soul series, and I hate the inclusion of these types of status effects. It really is just a cheap way of dying. While we move on through, we find the parade master back in his old spot, but now he has a new hairdo. As previously he ripped off his own head to use as an axe, now he has a large carcass growth and one or two new moves. However, this fight is something that I have trained for, as within seconds the boss has disappeared. Our damage output on enemies like this, where I don't realistically need to worry about their moveset, is rather extreme, as if I can get an opening of, say, 5 to 10 seconds, I can probably deal 50% or more of a boss's health bar. Back to the Hotel Krat, and the Black Rabbit gang has broken into our safe space and stolen our dear old dad. Rather unfortunate, but everyone seems to still be alive, so, okay, let's go and save our dad. Behind the painting that the proprietress has been staring at is a elevator down to the basement. And the basement is an ancient ruins, apparently. So, sure. Oh, okay. From here, we find the remaining 3 Black Rabbit siblings, and again, finding an old boss with new life is just so cathartic. As we completely mop the floor with the Black Rabbit siblings, as they now each have to be killed, but they have nowhere near as much health as their older brother did. Speaking of, it turns out there is a phase 2 to this fight, as the coffin that they've been carrying around has been outfitted with the same tech that brought Champion Victor back to us. And now we have a rematch with the oldest sibling of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood. At this point, I had gone a little bit overboard with the enjoyment and may have applied a little bit too much of my consumables to the previous 3 siblings, as I'd run fairly low. But menuing mid-boss fight is something I'm fairly used to, so moving on and throwing everything, including the pipes from the kitchen sink, at him, we eventually do take him down. And beyond here, we find a lever that will summon an entire submarine, which is thankfully self-driving, and we can power it with this car battery. Weird choice, but I'll take it. At this point, we have reached the final area of the game, and it is very, very story heavy. I have been trying to keep anything but the bosses out of this, as most of the story beats are irrelevant to the challenge, and I truly want you to play this if you have the ability to. To start with, we dodge past all of the cannons in front of the fortress, and when we make it to the door, we fight our resident fire giant clone. As not only do we have to smack at his legs until he reacts and shows us his weak spot, but that is all we can strike. For some reason, you're only able to hit either the chest, which is not effective unless he has fallen down, or specifically the right leg. You cannot target the left. I'm not sure why, but realistically, we burn down the leg and just continue to beat on this guy, as he is essentially just a champion Victor clone with a annoying mechanic, as you're supposed to knock him down and get the visceral attack, which we cannot as we don't have a weapon. So the damage resistance on this guy is through the roof, as I don't believe criticals are reduced by any kind of resistances. So after chipping him down for what felt like the better part of 20 minutes, we got our Alchemist badge and were able to enter the tower proper. Now, there are not that many bosses left in this game. First, we make our way most of the way up the tower, and we find the imposing figure that took down the revived champion back at the Grand Exhibition. And this is my favourite boss fight. This fight is just incredibly satisfying, as we have a mix of slow, high damage attacks, with the occasional quick combo thrown in to keep you on your toes, as well as some area attacks that are laced with ergo. But the fight doesn't really start heating up until that second phase, where this becomes a spectacular mix of long-range dodging, avoiding lightning-quick jabs and pokes, all with very few opportunities to counter or heal. This fight is clearly a showcase of how far you've come with the perfect block system. But as we don't have that as an option, this mainly devolves into panic rolling and taking any opportunities we can to try and not miss with our arsenal of throwable goods. I found that you can actually stack status effects in this game. It doesn't show that you can, but if we throw some decay and inflict that, and then immediately begin to stack fire, the damage numbers will change to that of the fire debuff, but appear to be applying damage from both. Because of this, we managed to stack decay, combustion, and shock, and then slowly whittle her down using our trusty flamethrower. This definitely was the hardest fight in the game. Without question, it is the most fun I have had in this game, purely on combat alone. And if this ever gets DLC, a sequel, or anything like that, I hope the fights are even a fraction as fun and challenging as this one. Because even with this stupid challenge run idea, I've truly had a blast. After this, we get some story events and free our dad. We decide to tell him that we're disappointed in him and that he's never been there for us, as we move on to the big man himself. Now infused with massive quantities of ergo, Manus has turned into a horrid mass that makes me kind of uncomfortable. But the fight itself is not exactly the hardest fight we could have, as the first phase, and yes, I've said this a lot, the first phase of these fights are almost universally the absolute worst. But the first phase of this fight is essentially an upgraded champion Victor, but hear me out, he has a slightly longer reach, but also hear me out, his entire right side is basically free game. This made a very easy boss fight with just circling around. This is where we move into the second phase, as Manus is turned into a perfect being that only Mahito could love, as he becomes immediately handsy, capturing us in his own personal domain. And now it was finally time to put an end to this. While not as hectic as the previous fight against his champion, this fight had a good deal that we had to pay attention to, As previously we had one target doing several things at once, this fight needs a slightly different skill set, as Manus will summon areas of denial and projectiles that will track us, as well as being a general nuisance in the melee front. Instead of tracking a single target, we have to keep in mind for 2 or 3 things, and camera management becomes the paramount issue. It was tough, but with the reserve of tools we had, we were able to burn down the peak of human evolution and claim the arm of God for ourselves. At this point, we made our way down to the bottom of the tower, and we greeted Geppetto, as he offered to make us a real boy with the arm that we had acquired. And no matter what I do at this point, if I were to accept this offer, the credits would roll. We definitely can beat this game in one form or another without any weapons. But I can't in good conscience trust this shifty, absentee father. So I spit on his hospitality and kindness and decide that I don't want to be a real boy. And because we refuse to let Daddy touch our heart, this is where we get the single coolest scene, in my opinion, as Geppetto decides to go full Kankuro as he manually takes control of this puppet in his briefcase. And this is the real final fight. This nameless puppet. No, I'm serious. It makes a lot more sense in context, but just trust me. This is the second most technical fight in the game, as we have another human-sized opponent, but this one benefits from having an incredibly floaty movement style, likely thanks to the assistance from our scorned daddy. It becomes quite hard to predict some of the attacks of this beast, and coupled with the wide swings, it leads to some moments of panic as we are very easily caught off guard, but due to how ridiculously thick our armor is, most of the time we can make it out with about half our health left, but we still only have about 2 hits, give or take, before we absolutely need to heal. As phase 2 hits, he has no strings to hold him down, to make him fret or make him stop trying to kill me. As we move on to a much more hectic fight, as the scissors it used are split into 2 halves. Dual wielding this scissor sword hybrid was just amazing. I cannot praise the design choice here for the stringless puppet more. The fact that it is actually wielding scissors here is just beautiful. Our timings have become even more erratic as the puppet has lost its head. And at this point, we have some serious Soul of Cinder vibes as the puppet can switch from dual wielding to two-handing to some area-based ergo damage effects, all wrapped in this aerial, floaty combat style that would be massively infuriating if we didn't have all the range options we currently do. But in the end, we are still victorious, and I will not spoil any of the ending cutscenes, as I will again say that this game deserves a playthrough if you have the means to play it, and it was a truly lovely experience overall, and so far, this was my favourite release of the year. Outside of the first, second, and fourth bosses, we got by mainly without having to power level for the most part, as our money was mainly spent on consumables. But as soon as that Red Lobster merchant came along, we basically had no need to level up any further, and it made this idiotic reality a dream. If you're still here, I appreciate your time, and if you think it was well spent, a like or subscribe goes a long way to letting me know. If you have any suggestions for other challenges, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you when we do the next thing.